Harley's biggest secret is finally out. Riders everywhere are talking about the Milwaukee-Eight engines that run hot, lose oil, and leave owners stranded. Harley calls it normal. But leaked files say otherwise, and they're spreading fast. If you own 17 to 20, you need to hear this before your next ride. The clock's ticking before their way. Give you thousands. The symptom nobody wanted to name it started like the owners rolled out on their new touring bikes, feeling that signature happening. Engines that should have run smooth started gasping. Whispered through. One rider described hearing his own heart skip a beat. Another said his road glide felt thirsty for it was breathing through a straw. At first, riders blamed the heat riding style. Dealers echoed one line: "It's normal." His legacy made that believable until failures multiplied. On forums, lifelong owners compared notes, rising confidence as veterans realized identical couldn't be coincidence. Led by a brand they trusted. By 2017, to ignore. Bikes with barely began sputtering like old machines. To afford that legendary Harley found themselves. They had bought the dream, but something inside it was the silence. Harley Davidson, the company, acted like nothing was wrong. The cracks in that silence were just beginning to show. But inside Milwaukee, behind closed doors, there was paperwork that told a different story. Inside the service bulletin, the leak didn't come from an engine this time. It came from a printer. A confidential dealer bulletin surfaced online in the spring of 2018. It described customer reported oil transfer concerns and unintended oil migration between cavities. That sterile language hid a grim truth. The bulletin was Harley's first quiet admission that something inside the Milwaukee-Eight wasn't working as promised. Engineers knew it. Dealers knew it. Riders didn't. Within the bulletin, technicians were told how to test for something, a condition where oil pools in the crankcase instead of circulating freely. The instructions were clear. Drain the crankcase, measure the oil, compare it to factory, and note any excess. To the untrained eye, that looked like routine maintenance. To seasoned mechanics, it was a red flag. You don't measure pool oil unless you know it can happen. Dealers who followed the bulletin quietly fixed a few bikes under warranty, replacing pumps and breathers. But the company never issued a public statement, never alerted owners, and never used the word defect. Riders paid without knowing they were fixing a design flaw baked into the very heart of their engines. Some dealers even apologized privately, admitting their hands were tied by corporate interests. It wasn't sabotage. It was survival of the company culture that valued secrecy over transparency. But even whispers leave traces, and those traces led straight to a redesigned part that Harley hoped nobody would notice. If you've ever owned a Harley or felt let down by a brand you trusted, hit that like button now. Drop together, the harder it becomes for them to hide. The new pump that fixed the past. Late in 2019, riders noticed something. A new oil pump assembly for the Milwaukee-Eight. It carried a fresh part number with a quiet improved oil flow. No press release, no announcement, line, and a start. Those who worked on engines living knew what that meant. You couldn't design a pump unless the old one failed to do its job. Technicians who installed the new pump reported instant differences. Oil returned faster, heat dropped, and crankcases stayed dry even on long rides. It worked so well that Harley made it standard on the 2020 lineup and, tellingly, allowed it to retrofit older models. That decision spoke volumes. If the original system were perfect, there would be no need to retrofit. The company was fixing the flaw quietly, repairing history without admitting history needed repair. Independent engineers Harley say the original pump scavenger stage could cavitate under sustained heat, trapping air pockets and starving the lower end of lubrication. That simple design issue caused a cascade of failures, from worn bearings to seized pistons. It was a defect of physics, not user error. The improved pump solved it, but the absence of a public explanation left owners angry. They paid top dollar for reliability and ended up as unpaid beta testers. Yet instead of a recall, Harley doubled down on discretion and if you're digging yourself, start with solid gear and accessories. I've linked my go-tos in the description. Bulletin versus recall, the language of denial. When automakers discover a flaw that threatens reliability, they issue a recall. When Harley found one, it wrote a bulletin. The difference seems small until you realize a recall letters, public only between the factory and dealers. It's the corporate version of a whisper. Internal memos, words like defect, swapping them for sensitivity. Drivers were told loss was normal, even as mechanics drained excess quartz. By calling it a service advisory, Harley dodged recall law. Truth reached owners only after damage was done. This tactic saved millions in recall costs, but cost something far greater: credibility. A company that built its empire on authenticity. Some longtime dealers struggled with warning loyal customers to pump while pretending it was routine service. Others unwilling to risk. The disconnect between the official and the shop floor was glaring, and that policy left one haunting question hanging in every garage. Silence, who protects the riders now? The riders turned investigators. To acknowledge the pattern, the riders did it themselves. Across the country, garages became laboratories. Men and women who once trusted Harley service bays began tearing their own Milwaukee-Eight engines apart, documenting every scar and every drop of oil that refused to return home. What began as frustration turned into a movement of data. Riders started tracking by year, mileage, and build. They built spreadsheets, shared photos of drained crankcases, and compared oil analyses that showed contamination long before the factory admitted anything. YouTube teardown videos exposed scorched pumps, starved bearings, undeniable are hid. A retired Michigan engineer modeled the flaw, proving oil trapped in the head starved the sump. His viral report ignited the Harley community's demand for accountability. Soon, the data collection turned methodical. Forums standardized templates for documenting breakdowns, complete VIN numbers, and oil sample results. Readers discovered that certain batches, mostly built between 2017 and 2019, failed. The factory called coincidence looked at a pattern. Harley might have had official bulletins, but riders now had something better. Proof grounded in reality, not in marketing. And when ordinary people gather this much truth, the lawyers are never far behind. Lawyers smell gasoline. Law firms across several states began taking calls from frustrated owners who had paid thousands of repairs that never lasted. Riders did. A corporate structure that knew too much and said too little. Within months, class actions began forming. Each complaint told the same story in different voices. Harley Davidson sold bikes with a hidden through service bulletins and failed to recall or reimburse customers properly. The first major filing out of California: negligence, concealment, and breach of warranty. Soon another appeared in Texas, backed by dozens of owners and a handful of sympathetic mechanics. Leaked communications from dealer networks became exhibits, revealing how regional managers instructed service departments to reassure customers rather than document defects. In simple terms, that was devastating. A paper trail of denial is still a paper trail. Attorneys interviewed former employees under confidentiality agreement, confirming what writers suspected for years. Engineers warned management about oil starvation risks during early testing. Those warnings never made it to the public. In depositions, technicians described receiving updated parts with no written explanation to install fixes while pretending the issue was minor. The legal filings turned those experiences into official evidence, but anger doesn't just hit the courtroom, it hits the wallet. As lawsuits multiplied, a storm began brewing in the marketplace itself. When loyalty loses value for decades, Harley-Davidson motorcycles were one of the safest financial bets in motorcycling. A 5-year-old Street Glide could sell for nearly what it cost new. The brand carried out pride, but that changed the moment the Milwaukee-Eight scandal reached public ears. Suddenly, trade-in values collapsed. Dealers began cutting offers by thousands, citing engine liability concerns. Owners discovered that their symbol of freedom had turned into a liability parked in their garage. At auctions, Harleys piled up as buyers asked, "Has the pump been replaced?" Trust evaporated. Banks raised rates or refused loans, and the brand, once powered by loyalty, now struggled under the weight of doubt and risk. Numbers told a brutal story. A model that once held 10% of its original value now fetched barely 60%. In financial terms, that meant a $10,000 hit for the average owner. Heavier, the emotional loss of pride. These riders didn't see themselves to realize that legacy had been cheapened by corporate silence felt like betrayal twice over. That tremor reached all the way to Milwaukee, where investors were beginning to see the same reflected on corporate boardroom under siege. Inside Harley's headquarters, meetings once filled with optimism. Reports and class action filings arrived faster than marketing could spin them. Executives watched share prices wobble as news outlets picked up the story. For a company built on image, the perception of betrayal was more dangerous. Behind doors, internal a technical challenge, it was a brand crisis. Confidence blink. Investors wanted answers. Why had management ignored early engineering warnings? Why were bulletins used instead of recall? And how much full transparency cost in compensation and lawsuits? Leadership changes followed quietly. 2 senior managers of product integrity stepped down. A task force formed to review customer satisfaction metrics, a polite phrase that really meant damage control. At the same time, engineers were told to accelerate development of a next-generation powertrain to restore faith. But designing a new engine doesn't rebuild trust overnight. It wanted honesty, not prototypes. During one tense earnings, the CEO admitted the company did not respond swiftly enough to field concerns. For Wall Street, that sounded like responsibility. For writers, it sounded like too little, too late. The gap between boardroom and blacktop had never felt wider. Harley's were shrinking. And might hope that financial fixes could quiet the outrage, but the writers weren't done yet. Buried in the engines was still burning hot. How the Milwaukee-Eight starves itself. Every machine tells the truth through its failure. When engineers finally tore apart the Milwaukee-Eight, they found that the same power that gave it its legendary torque was also its curse. The scavenging system high heat and load. Independent analysts studying dyno results noticed oil pooling where it should have flowed. At cruising temperature, small air pockets formed a pump scavenger stage. That trapped oil in the heads, starting the crankcase of lubrication. Pressure dropped, bearings ran dry, increased, and the engine turned against itself. It was design failure. The Milwaukee-Eight's dual pump demanded perfect timing, imbalance something, trapping oil below the crankshaft. Spiked, oil misted. A silent confession of engineering. These discoveries were not theoretical. Viewed by hundreds of thousands of readers online. Every measurement, every worn bearing told the same story. This engine was suffocating in its own oil. What should have been a masterpiece of American engineering became a lesson in what happens when pride outruns physics. And just as one flaw exposed itself in the crankcase, another was hiding deeper. The oil didn't stay where it belonged. The primary links the transmission. Every Harley technician knows that the engine, transmission, and primary case are three chambers in a delicate dance of oil management. But with the Milwaukee-Eight, the dance turned chaotic. Let transmission fluid migrate. A subtle but costly problem. Riders would service their bike overfilled and dry. The company labeled it oil transfer, as if the engine were politely flowing from itself. In reality, it was bleeding internally. Photos showed vent kits modified seals fixing pressure imbalances between and primary. Oil pushed past the primary, clutches, and not imagined. A quiet bulletin surfaced soon after, instructing dealers to an updated inner recall. The official note described it as an enhancement, though every mechanic who handled it knew it was a repair. Those who performed the fix said the difference was immediate. The clutch feel returned, engagement stabilized, migration stopped. The problem had been solved mechanically, yet never acknowledged publicly. But behind the sealed cases and polite bulletins were people, workers who saw these flaws every day and were told to pretend they didn't exist. The workers who couldn't speak. Inside Harley's factories and dealerships, to the machines were the ones most trapped by silence. Line workers assembling engines in Wisconsin noticed early on that oil pumps were being reworked and replaced mid-production. Questions to supervisors, but the answer were always they were told, or routine revision. In truth, many knew these changes were attempts to patch a problem fixed in design, not on the floor. Dealership techs watched repeat failures but couldn't say defect. Parts marked for destruction were reboxed by non-disclosure. Silence wasn't loyalty anymore, it was survival. One anonymous technician described how each new service bulletin we replaced a pump. Fixing bikes, we were resetting the clock. For workers who grew up believing Harley stood for integrity, deep, right. Found their voices and turned that silence into a rallying cry. If you deserve honesty, not silence, subscribe right now. We're uncovering the truths Harley was time. Stand and ride knowing the truth is finally on our side. The brotherhood becomes the watchdog. Out of anger grew something stronger, unity. Across every region, Harley riders began organizing not just rides, but investigations. What started as scattered conversations online turned into a coordinated network of watchdogs determined to protect their own. Podcasts dedicated to dissecting leaked bulletins. YouTube channels once focused on gear review. Riders across borders, translating service data and publishing guides that rivaled factory manuals. They weren't fueled by hate. They were driven by love for the machine that had betrayed them. Every tutorial, every teardown, every live stream was an act of defiance and preservation. The brotherhood that once relied on corporate pride now relied on collective knowledge. They exposed serial number clusters, tested aftermarket solutions, and even 3D printed improved oil passages to fix what the ignored. It was grassroots engineering at its purest form. As the movement grew, Harley's corporate silence began to look smaller. The company that once held was now being fact-checked in real time by the very right of its legacy. Forums turned into archives, YouTube comments into case studies, and garage floors into classrooms. Writers spoke of transparency not as a wish, but as a duty. And as the question echoed, could regulators and the papers, Harley Davidson's greatest defense, but silence live in front of government, began filing of National Highway Traffic Safety Administration the forums and entered the federal record. Each denial from the dealer. Individually, they were anecdotes. Together, they became data. Regulators began connecting dots Harley hoped would stay scattered. By mid-2024, federal investigators requested internal documents including the now infamous service bulletins M1450 and T466. Those files, once labeled confidential, the public database. Read the language Harley used to describe its oil transfer concerns. The euphemism on Capitol Hill noticed. A small committee on consumer safety convened to ask why one of America's most iconic brands directly to engine safety. Congressional aides called it the most polite cover-up on record. Behind the scenes, regulators weighed whether Harley's laws. Even if no criminal intent could be proven, the optics were terrible. Hearings were quiet but symbolic, a signal that legacy no longer excused rising in the opportunity. When Harley faltered, others revved up. Indian motorcycles, Harley built around 4 simple words: heritage without compromise. Billboards showed riders with captions like "No leaks, no excuse." The message was unmistakable. Dealers who struggled to compete suddenly saw crowds of riders in black leather jackets wandering in rooms out of curiosity. BMW's touring division joined the chase, promoting its R18 line with phrases like "engineered tradition." Triumph. Reliability in a market won by emotion and practicality had entered the conversation. The new generation of riders loyalty speeches, they wanted bikes that worked. By late 2024, Harley's cruiser share fell below 50% as Indian and BMW surged. These weren't random gains, but confidence transfers. While Harley stayed silent, rivals won rider transparency, real recalls, and reliability that spoke louder than heritage. Yet while competitors gained ground, the people inside Harley's own factories faced a more personal struggle, balancing pride in their work with the shame of what they saw slip through. Inside factory gates, on the assembly lines of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the noise of production hides many emotions. Harley's workers took pride in bolt and bearing. Building wasn't just a job, it was a calling. But as the Milwaukee-Eight scandal unfolded, that pride fractured. Workers watched headlines blame the company. Some whispered to each other that the problem wasn't just mechanical, it was moral. Union representatives collecting statements from employees worried about quality control. Few mentioned being told to meet quotas even when parts did perfectly. Others described midline revisions with little explanation. If someone were patching a leak, no one could mention. Management meetings grew tense. While service trust and quiet frustration simmered between shifts. One veteran assembler with 20 years at the plant summed it up. We build legends, but legends shouldn't leak. Spread like wildfire through internal chats. Workers wanted accountability, not punishment. They understood that every bad engine was a black mark on their craftsmanship, but they also knew the orders came from above. Pride and fear wrestled on every line, and while the factory wrestled with conscience, the riders themselves realized they could wait for anyone else to fix what was broken. The riders' next move. America, a community that exposed the scandal, shaping a movement for change. Riders formed groups dedicated to transparency, safety, and consumer rights. They weren't driven by anger anymore, but by determination. Organizations drafting open letters to Harley leadership and to regulators demanding independent oversight of engine design. Workshops became town halls as mechanics hosted free inspections. Laws. What began as outrage evolved into advocacy. Riders united not to protect, but to defend the integrity of American craftsmanship. Consumers and publishing rider documentation guides, helping others track service history and report defects. Each built a living record that no corporation could erase. Independent journalists picked up the story, following the paper trail from factory floors to boardroom minutes. Every revelation chipped away at the old power dynamic. For the first time in decades, the riders, not the executive, were shaping the narrative of Harley-Davidson. Transformation was profound. The roar of the Milwaukee-Eight had once symbolized rebellion against conformity. Now it symbolized accountability against deception. In garages, old banners still hung proudly, but beneath them lay new tools, spreadsheets, oil kits, and cameras aimed at transparency. The legend wasn't dead, it was being rebuilt by the people alive through truth. And so the question remains, carried on every mile of asphalt ahead, will the next era of Harley-Davidson be used to let history repeat itself? Harley built this, but somewhere along the way, honesty took the back seat. The Milwaukee-Eight should have been their proudest engine, not another secret buried in a service bulletin. If you've seen these issues on your own bike, drop your year and mileage in the comments below. Keep the receipts rolling. Hit that like button if you believe riders deserve the truth, excuses. And if you're new here, subscribe. Around this garage, we don't take the factory's word for it.